The first time I saw Cole Hastings bleed, I almost laughed out loud in front of the entire garrison. He had been repairing a water filtration unit on the eastern wall of Outpost Rethanon, and a jagged panel edge sliced clean across his palm. Red liquid pooled in the lines of his hand and dripped onto the stone floor, and he hissed through his teeth, like the pain was something worth acknowledging. A Kithrin child could have taken that cut and kept working without blinking. My husband, this creature the Galactic Concordance had bonded me to in the name of political unity, stood there pressing a cloth against his hand and breathing through it like he was managing a wound that mattered. I turned away before anyone could see my face, not because I felt sympathy, because I felt embarrassed. That was 3 months into our arrangement, and by then, I had already built a complete catalog of every way Cole Hastings was beneath me. It was not something I did with cruelty. It was something I did with facts. I am Valith Sorand, rank commander of the 9th Kithrin Shield Wall, decorated twice for valor in close combat during the Varen border campaigns, blooded at age 14 in the proving pits of Karath Prime. My skin is layered with dermal plating that can deflect low-caliber projectile fire. My bones are reinforced with mineral deposits that make them nearly unbreakable. I can see in spectrums your human eyes cannot process, and I can go 4 days without sleep before my performance degrades by a single measurable percentage. I was born for war, the way a blade is born for cutting. Cole Hastings was born soft, pink, fragile. He sweated in the heat of Rethanon like his body could not regulate its own temperature. He ate 3 times a day because his species could not store energy for more than a few hours without becoming sluggish. He slept for 1/3 of every rotation, collapsing into unconsciousness, as though his brain simply gave up on functioning at regular intervals. And every single morning, without exception, he woke before dawn and ran the perimeter trail of the outpost for nearly an hour, returning drenched in perspiration and breathing hard, as though this ritual of self-punishment was something to be proud of. I watched him from the observation deck on those mornings, not because I cared, because I could not understand it. Why would a creature that was already weak voluntarily exhaust itself further? A Kithrin warrior does not need to maintain strength. We are born with it. It lives in our blood and bone from the first breath we take. The idea of needing to practice being strong was, to me, the clearest possible confession of biological inadequacy. The marriage itself was not my choice. The Concordance Treaty between the Kithrin Dominion and the Human Coalition required bonding unions at every joint outpost, a political mechanism designed to create personal stakes in the survival of the alliance. I was chosen because of my rank, and because my commanding officers believed my discipline would prevent me from killing my assigned partner in the first week. Cole was chosen because he had served in some branch of the human military, though I never bothered to learn which one. When they told me I would be bonded to a human male, I accepted it the way I would accept a difficult posting to a frozen moon. It was duty, nothing more. Cole accepted it quietly. He arrived at Rethanon with one bag, shook my hand with that soft, breakable grip of his, and said he was glad to meet me. He did not try to impress me. He did not posture or puff himself up the way I had seen other species do when confronted with a Kithrin warrior. He simply existed in my space with a calm that I interpreted, at the time, as the passivity of a prey animal that knows it cannot fight. The outpost became our shared cage. Rethanon was a frontier installation on a dry, wind-scoured moon at the edge of contested space, home to 36 Kithrin warriors, 12 human support personnel, and roughly 200 civilian colonists from both species. It was not a glamorous posting. The air was thin, the sun was harsh, and the only strategic value of the place was its position near the Vale Corridor, a dead transit lane between 2 territories that nobody had used in decades. We were there because the treaty said someone had to be. Cole settled into routines that baffled me. He cooked, not just for himself but for me as well, preparing meals that combined human and Kithrin ingredients with surprising skill. I ate what he made because it was convenient, not because I appreciated the gesture. He studied our customs, learning Kithrin greeting forms and table manners, and the proper way to address warriors of different ranks. I saw this as groveling, a small creature trying to make itself useful, so the larger creatures would not crush it. He spent hours in the outpost's communication center, monitoring long-range signal arrays and analyzing data patterns that scrolled across his screens in endless ribbons of light. I considered this clerical work, the kind of task assigned to people who could not be trusted with a weapon. He asked me about my day. Every evening, the same question, delivered in that steady voice of his. How was your day? I gave him short answers. Fine. Busy. Nothing you would understand. He never pushed. He never argued. He never raised his voice or challenged my dismissals, or demanded the respect that a bonded partner might reasonably expect. I took this as further proof that he was what I believed him to be. A quiet, compliant, fundamentally harmless creature who had been placed in my life by bureaucratic necessity and nothing else. My soldiers agreed with me. Lieutenant Draven, my second in command, had a particular talent for jokes at Cole's expense. He called him the soft one when Cole was not around, and sometimes when he was. The garrison laughed. I laughed with them. I never once defended my husband, because I did not believe there was anything to defend. Then one evening, 6 days before everything changed, Cole looked up from his monitoring station and said something that I dismissed so completely that the memory of my own arrogance still makes my chest tight when I think about it now. He said the long-range signal array had been picking up irregular patterns from beyond the Veil corridor. He said the patterns were consistent with large-scale fleet movement. He said he had been tracking them for 2 days and they were getting stronger. I was eating at the time, a meal he had prepared, and I did not even stop chewing. The Veil corridor was dead space. Nothing moved through it. I told him he was jumping at shadows, that the sensor equipment on a frontier outpost was not exactly cutting edge, and that signal echoes from distant stellar activity were common in this region. He listened to my explanation with that expression he always wore when I dismissed him, a slight tightening around his eyes that I read as resignation. He nodded, said he would keep monitoring, and turned back to his screens. I went to bed that night feeling the same comfortable superiority I had felt every night since our bonding. I was a warrior, married to a clerk, and the clerk was seeing monsters in the static. I woke once during the night, briefly, pulled from sleep by nothing in particular. Through the gap in the partition that separated our sleeping areas, I could see the pale glow of his monitoring station still active. He was sitting there in the dark, headset on, eyes moving across data streams. He had not slept. I rolled over and closed my eyes and thought, with a contempt so casual it felt like breathing, this is what I married. A man who is afraid of silence. I did not know then that silence was exactly what he was right to fear. That the thing moving through the Veil corridor was not a signal echo or stellar noise. That in less than a week, the silence would break open and pour 6,000 screaming nightmares across our doorstep. And that the soft, sweating, bleeding, breakable man I had written off as nothing would be the only thing standing between all of us and annihilation. But I did not know that yet. So I slept, and he did not, and the distance between what I believed and what was true grew wider with every hour I spent not listening. 3 days after Cole first mentioned the signal anomaly, I was running combat drills with the garrison in the training yard behind the main compound. The air was hot and gritty, the way it always was on Rethan, and my warriors moved through their formations with the precision I demanded. Kytheran close combat technique is built on controlled aggression, the ability to channel raw physical power through disciplined movement patterns that maximize the advantage of our armored bodies. Watching my soldiers work was one of the few pleasures the outpost afforded me. They were magnificent, dense, powerful, lethal, each one of them capable of tearing through light vehicle armor with their bare hands. During a rest period, Draven walked over to me with that grin he wore when he had something clever to say. He nodded toward the communications building where Cole was visible through a window, hunched over his screens as always, and asked if my human husband would like to join the sparring rotation. He said it loud enough for the nearby warriors to hear. The laughter that followed was immediate and unrestrained. Someone suggested they could give Cole a head start. Someone else said they should use practice weapons so they would not accidentally destroy him. I stood there and let it happen. I smiled. I did not say a word in his defense. Looking back, I wonder if Cole heard them. The windows were not soundproofed, and human hearing, while inferior to ours in range, is more than adequate at that distance. I wonder if he sat there listening to my soldiers mock him, and to my silence, which was louder than any mockery, and whether it hurt him. I wonder, and the wondering is its own punishment, because I will never ask him, and he will never tell me. 2 hours after the drills ended, Cole did something he had never done before. He submitted a formal request for a tactical briefing with me and Outpost Commander Torath, not a casual mention over dinner. A formal request, filed through proper channels, with supporting documentation attached. Torath granted it because protocol required him to, though his expression when he told me about it suggested he found the whole thing slightly absurd. We met in the command center, the three of us. Torath sat behind the main tactical display, a broad-shouldered Kytheran with 40 years of service, and the permanent scowl of someone who has seen everything and been impressed by none of it. I stood to his left. Cole stood across from us and presented his case. He had been tracking the signal patterns for 5 days. He had isolated them from background noise, mapped their trajectory, and compared them against known fleet movement signatures in the Galactic database. The patterns were consistent, he said, with a Vraxian battle swarm. He put the analysis on the display, and I watched columns of data scroll past, annotated with his notes in precise, methodical handwriting that he had translated into Kytheran script for our benefit. The Vraxians. Even the name sent a cold ripple through the room, though Torath was too experienced to show it, and I was too proud. The Vraxians were a hive-mind insectoid species, billions strong, that expanded their territory through sheer overwhelming numbers. They did not negotiate, they did not retreat. They consumed. A Vraxian battle swarm could number in the tens of thousands, a churning tide of armored bodies and acid-spitting attack drones that washed over fortified positions like water over rock. They had not been active in our sector for years, but the memory of what they could do was embedded in every species' military doctrine, like a scar that never fully healed. Torath studied the data for a long time. Then he said the patterns were more likely sensor echoes from the magnetar cluster beyond the corridor. He said Vraxian swarms produced specific subspace harmonics that Cole's analysis had not definitively confirmed. He said in the measured tone of a commander who does not want to cause unnecessary alarm that the evidence was suggestive but not conclusive. Cole stood there and took it. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply said that he had already forwarded the raw data to the nearest human naval relay station as a precautionary measure, and that he recommended we begin reviewing our evacuation protocols. The temperature in the room dropped. Torath's scowl deepened into something harder. Forwarding data to a human military relay without the outpost commander's authorization was a breach of chain of command, and Cole knew it. He had done it anyway. Torath told him, in a voice that left no room for discussion, that the matter was noted, and that no further action would be taken unless the data was confirmed by Kytheran military intelligence. Cole nodded once, gathered his documentation, and left. I followed him out. I was furious, though not for the reason I should have been. I was furious because he had embarrassed me. My husband, the soft one, had stood in front of my commanding officer and implied that we were in danger, that our defenses were inadequate, that we needed to prepare for something terrible, and he had done it with my name attached to his. I told him as much. I told him he did not understand Kytheran command structure, that he had overstepped, that Torath would remember this, and that the stain would be on my record as much as his. He listened to all of it. He stood in the corridor outside the command center and let me empty my frustration onto him, like I was pouring acid on stone. And when I was finished, he said something that stopped me cold. He said, "I have been in rooms like that before, where everyone agreed the threat was not real. I buried the people who were in those rooms." His voice was not loud, it was not angry. It was the flattest, quietest thing I had ever heard, and it carried a weight that pressed against my chest like a physical force. I did not know how to respond. I told him he was being dramatic, and even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were hollow. He looked at me for a long moment with an expression I could not read, something old and heavy behind his eyes, and then he turned and walked away. Over the next 2 days, I noticed things, small things. Things I would not have paid attention to if that conversation had not lodged itself like a splinter beneath my thoughts. Cole checked the outpost's emergency evacuation protocols. He pulled up the blueprints of the subsurface thermal vent system that ran beneath the compound and traced the route to the southern ridge with his finger, measuring distances, noting junctions and collapse risk points. He inventoried the medical supplies in the infirmary. counting bandages and wound sealant and plasma packs with the focused attention of someone preparing for something specific. He tested the backup power generators, cycling each one through its startup sequence, and timing how long it took to reach full output. He walked the entire perimeter of the outpost, not running this time but walking slowly, pausing at certain points, and looking out at the terrain as though he was memorizing it. I saw him crouching near rock formations and studying sightlines. I saw him pacing distances between structures. I caught him in the armory once, standing in front of the human weapons rack. The outpost maintained a small stockpile of human standard firearms as part of the joint species arrangement, rifles and sidearms that the Kithiran warriors had never touched and never would. Our weapons were integrated into our armor systems, energy-based and calibrated for our strength. The human guns sat in their rack like relics from a lesser age. Cole was examining them one by one, checking mechanisms, testing weight and balance, counting ammunition. I asked him what he was doing. He said he was familiarizing himself. I told him that warriors do not need to familiarize themselves with their weapons, because real warriors know their weapons from birth. He put the rifle back on the rack and said nothing. I should have seen it. Every single thing he did during those 2 days was preparation. He was not a man consumed by fear. He was a man who had been afraid before, many times, and had learned that fear without preparation is how people end up dead. He was building a plan inside his head, piece by piece, quiet as breathing, and I walked past it every day like it was furniture. On the third night after his briefing with Torath, I was pulled from sleep by the outpost's proximity alarm. It was a sound I had heard in drills but never in reality, a deep, pulsing tone that vibrated through the walls and the floor and the frame of my sleeping platform. I was on my feet and moving before the second pulse. Training took over, and I was pulling on my armor components as I ran toward the command center, my body shifting into combat readiness with the practiced ease of a soldier who has done this 1,000 times. When I arrived at the command center, Cole was already there. He was sitting at the communications console, and the data streaming across his screens was dense with red markers. Commander Torath arrived seconds after me, followed by Draven and the duty officer. The room filled quickly with tense bodies and sharp voices. Cole turned from his console and looked directly at Torath. His face was calm, not the calm of ignorance or denial, but the terrible, settled calm of someone who has seen what is coming and has already accepted it. He said 2 words. Vraxian swarm. The tactical display confirmed it. A massive contact cloud was advancing through the Veil corridor toward Rethon. The sensor array, now fully locked on the approaching signatures, painted a picture that made my stomach drop. Thousands of individual contacts, moving in the coordinated wave patterns characteristic of hive mind assault formations. The estimated count updated every few seconds as the resolution sharpened, and each update was worse than the last. 4,000, 5,000. The number settled around 6,000 and held. 6,000 Vraxian assault organisms against an outpost garrison of 36 warriors. Torath's face was the color of ash. He turned to the communications officer and ordered an immediate distress signal to the nearest Kithiran fleet. The response came back within minutes. The 7th Patrol Fleet was 19 hours away at maximum speed. 19 hours. An eternity. Then Cole spoke again. He said the human naval relay he had contacted days earlier had acknowledged his data and dispatched a response force. Estimated arrival, 12 hours. 7 hours closer than our own fleet, because Cole had broken protocol and sent the warning that Torath had dismissed. Torath stared at him. The anger and the grudging recognition fought visibly across his features. He said nothing about the breach of command. There was no point anymore. The swarm would arrive in 11 hours, and whether we lived or died might very well depend on the decision Cole had made in defiance of his orders. I stood in that command center, surrounded by warriors whose faces reflected the same grim calculation I was making in my own head, and I looked at my husband. He was not looking at me. He was studying the tactical display with an intensity that seemed to bend the light around him, his eyes moving across terrain maps and approach vectors and timing estimates with a speed and focus that I had never seen from him before. He was not afraid. He was not panicking. He was not posturing. He was calculating. And for the first time since the day I met him, I felt something shift inside me. Not respect, not yet. Something smaller and colder. The faint, sharp edge of doubt. Doubt about every assumption I had made. Doubt about every joke I had laughed at. Doubt about the story I had told myself. The one where I was the warrior, and he was the weakness I had been forced to carry. I pushed it down. There was no time for doubt. There was only the swarm, and the clock, and the 11 hours standing between us and something that could eat this outpost down to bare rock. Torath called a war council. Every ranking officer in the garrison crowded into the command center, and the air grew thick with the heat of armored bodies and the sharp smell of adrenaline. Plans were thrown out and torn apart. Defensive positions were debated. Ammunition counts were recited. The civilians, 200 men and women and children sleeping in their quarters, with no idea that the silence outside was about to shatter, became the heaviest variable in every equation. Through all of it, Cole sat at his console and said nothing. He watched, he listened, he let the Kytheran officers argue and strategize and posture, and he waited with the patience of a man who knows that the room will eventually run out of bad ideas and turn to him for a better one. It took an hour and 40 minutes. Torath's plan was to fortify the outpost and hold the walls until the fleets arrived. It was the obvious plan, the Kytheran plan, the plan that trusted in armored bodies and defensive positions, and the raw physical superiority that had won us every siege in our recorded history. It was also, as Cole quietly pointed out when the room finally fell silent and turned to him, a plan that would result in the total destruction of every living thing inside these walls. He stood up from his console and walked to the tactical display. He moved through the crowd of towering Kytheran warriors like water through stones, and nobody stepped in his way. Something in his bearing had changed. The quiet deference was gone. The accommodating posture that I had mistaken for submission had been replaced by something harder and more angular. The way a tool looks different when you finally understand what it was built to do. He pointed to the outpost walls and said they would hold for 2 hours against Vraxian siege acid, maybe less depending on which strains the swarm was carrying. Once breached, the Vraxians would pour through in numbers that no defensive formation could contain. 36 warriors fighting 6,000 in close quarters was not a battle. It was a processing line, and we were the raw material. Then he laid out his plan. Evacuate the civilians through the subsurface thermal vents. The vent system ran south beneath the compound and emerged on the southern ridge, 3 kilometers away, where the terrain was broken and elevated and defensible enough to shelter 200 people until the fleets arrived. The vents were tight for Kytheran bodies but passable, and the Vraxians, built for surface assault, would not follow underground. The garrison would split, the majority escorting the civilians through the tunnels, a holding force staying behind to defend the northern approach, the only viable attack corridor, long enough for the evacuation to complete. Torath asked how long the northern approach needed to be held. Cole said, 3 hours minimum. Torath asked how many warriors the holding force would need. Cole said a squad of 12 on the secondary line would be sufficient if the forward position was properly prepared. And then he said, the thing that changed everything. He said he would take the forward position alone, one man, at the mouth of the northern approach, buying time for the secondary line behind him. He asked for the entire human weapons stockpile, every rifle, every sidearm, every round of ammunition, and whatever mining charges the outpost had in storage. He asked for access to the maintenance equipment bays, and he asked for 6 hours to prepare the ground. The room went silent. Not the productive silence of soldiers considering a plan. The stunned silence of people hearing something that does not fit inside their understanding of the world. I laughed. The sound came out before I could stop it, sharp and reflexive, not cruel but disbelieving. One human at the forward position against a Vraxian swarm. It was absurd. It was the kind of statement that a child might make before they understood what war actually was. Cole looked at me. His expression was something I had never seen on his face before, and it stopped the laughter in my throat, like a hand closing around my windpipe. There was no anger in it, no hurt. There was a focus so absolute and a certainty so deep that it seemed to come from somewhere beneath his bones, from some place inside him that I had never known existed. His eyes held mine, and he said, in a voice that was quiet enough to fill the entire room. "I know what I am, Valeth. You do not." Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. Torath looked at Cole for a long time, and whatever he saw in that steady human gaze was enough. He approved the plan. What followed was the most extraordinary 6 hours I have ever witnessed, and I have fought in 4 campaigns and survived 2 sieges. The closest Kithaeron concept would be a death garden, a place designed not just to kill, but to kill efficiently, economically, in layers and waves that feed the enemy into a grinding machine of overlapping destruction. He started with the mining charges. The outpost kept a supply for geological survey work, compact explosive packages, designed to break rock. Cole retrieved every single one of them and carried them to the northern approach in a cargo cart, making 4 trips without stopping. He spent an hour studying the terrain, walking the approach corridor from end to end, crouching behind rock formations, sighting along natural channels, measuring distances by pacing them out with his feet. Then he began placing charges. Not randomly, not in a simple defensive line. He buried them in a staggered pattern across the approach, each one positioned at a specific distance from its neighbors, each one angled to direct its blast in a calculated direction. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was creating a funnel. He rigged detonation triggers from components he pulled from the maintenance bays, wiring each charge to a handheld controller that he built from spare communication equipment. He tested each connection twice. He numbered them on a piece of tape on the controller so he could fire them in sequence without looking down. Then he went to work on the turrets. The outpost did not have automated weapon platforms. What it had was 4 maintenance walkers, bipedal utility machines used for heavy lifting and repair work on the outer walls. Cole stripped the tool arms off 2 of them and mounted human standard rifles in their place, bolting the weapons to the articulation joints and wiring the trigger mechanisms to the walker's basic motor control systems. He programmed each one to sweep a specific arc of fire, covering the flanking channels on either side of the main approach. They were crude, ugly, and nothing a proper military engineer would have approved. They were also, as I would learn in a few hours, devastatingly effective. He positioned his own weapons next. 7 rifles, placed at intervals along a line of shallow fighting positions that he dug into the rocky ground with a hand tool. Each position was just deep enough to shield a prone human body, just wide enough to allow lateral movement, and spaced so that he could move from one to the next in seconds. He loaded each rifle and placed spare magazines within reach. He set his sidearms, 2 of them, at the rearmost position as a final fallback. He applied a chemical compound to his exposed skin, something from the human medical supplies that he said would mask his thermal signature from Vraxian sensory organs. He darkened his clothing with dust and mineral paste until he blended with the rock. He drank water, ate a compressed ration bar, and checked his weapons one final time. The Kithaeron warriors assigned to the secondary line, 12 of our strongest, arrived at their positions and watched Cole work. Draven was among them. None of them spoke. None of them laughed. Whatever they were seeing in the way this man prepared for what was coming, it was something that transcended the easy mockery of the training yard. Even through my own lingering disbelief, I could feel it. Cole was not performing. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was executing a process that he had clearly executed before, a lethal routine worn smooth by repetition, and the calm efficiency of it was more unsettling than any war cry or display of strength I had ever witnessed. I found him at the forward position just before I was due to lead the first evacuation group into the tunnels. He was kneeling behind the first fighting position, checking the sight alignment on his lead rifle. The sun was low on the horizon, and the northern plains stretched out before us in a haze of dust and amber light. Somewhere beyond that haze, 6,000 Vraxian organisms were advancing toward us at a speed that our sensors tracked in real time, a red wave on the tactical display that grew closer with every refresh. I did not know what to say to him. I started to say something tactical, an offer to reassign warriors from the evacuation escort to his position. He shook his head without looking up. He said the warriors were more valuable protecting the civilians, and that the secondary line was his safety net if the forward position fell. He said it the way you might discuss supply logistics, flat and factual, as though the possibility of his own death was simply another variable in the calculation. Then he looked up at me, and his face softened for just a moment. The soldier faded, and the man I had lived with for months looked out at me from behind those tired, steady eyes. He said, "I am not doing this to prove anything to you. I am doing this because those are our people, yours and mine." I stood there with the wind pulling at my armor, and the taste of dust in my mouth, and I could not speak. Something was breaking inside me, some wall I had built between who he was and who I had decided he was, and the rubble of it was filling my throat. He turned back to his rifle. I turned away and walked toward the tunnels. The first group of civilians was already assembled at the tunnel entrance, families clutching bags and children, human and Kytheran alike, their faces tight with the kind of fear that comes from not fully understanding the danger, but sensing it in the way the adults around them moved. I organized them into lines. I gave orders. I did my job because that is what a Kytheran warrior does when the world is falling apart. She does her job. We were 200 meters into the tunnels when I heard the first sound carry through the rock above us. It was distant but unmistakable, a rising, keening shriek that seemed to come from the sky and the ground at the same time. The Vraxian swarm had reached visual range, 6,000 chitinous bodies pouring across the northern plain like a dark tide, their war cry harmonics vibrating at frequencies that made the stone around us hum. And then, cutting through that shriek like a blade through cloth, I heard something else. A sharp, steady crack. Then another, rhythmic, measured, controlled. One rifle, firing into the teeth of an army. The sound followed me into the darkness of the tunnels, and I carried it like a weight against my chest. Each shot a heartbeat, each heartbeat a question I could no longer avoid. What else had I been wrong about? The answer came in pieces, delivered through the communication link that Draven maintained from the secondary line as I guided civilians through the thermal vent system toward the southern ridge. I could not see the battle. I could only hear it, fragmented and filtered through Draven's voice, and the muffled percussion of explosions that traveled through 300 meters of solid rock. The first Vraxian wave hit the minefield 7 minutes after contact. Cole had timed the placement precisely, waiting until the leading edge of the swarm was fully inside the funnel before triggering the first ring of charges. Draven reported the detonation as a series of overlapping blasts that tore the approach corridor apart, throwing rock and chitin in every direction, and carving gaps in the Vraxian formation that momentarily disrupted their advance coordination. The hive mind adapted quickly, redirecting flow around the blast craters. But Cole had anticipated that. The blast pattern was not designed to stop them, it was designed to channel them into the firing arcs of his improvised turrets. The turrets opened up from elevated positions on either flank, pouring automatic fire into the compressed columns of Vraxians that the funnel had created. Draven said the effect was devastating. The Vraxians were armored against energy weapons, which was what they expected from Kytheran defenders. Human projectile weapons, firing high-velocity rounds that punched through chitin at close range, were something their biological defenses were not calibrated for. The turrets cut lanes through the swarm, stacking bodies in the narrow channels until the advancing organisms had to climb over their own dead. And through all of it, Cole moved. Draven's voice carried a tone I had never heard from him before, something between disbelief and reverence. He said Cole was firing from his first position, emptying a magazine in controlled bursts, then rolling out and sprinting to his second position before the Vraxians could zero in on his location. He was not staying still. He was flowing through his fighting positions like water through cracks in stone, appearing at one point, delivering lethal fire, and vanishing before the swarm could concentrate on him. Each position had a loaded rifle waiting. Each transition took seconds. The Vraxians could not track him because he never stayed in one place long enough to register as a fixed target. I processed this information while leading a column of frightened civilians through a tunnel system that was never designed for this many bodies. The vents were narrow, hot, and poorly lit, and the children were crying, and the adults were trying not to. A Kytheran woman carrying an infant asked me if we were going to survive. I told her yes with a confidence I did not feel, because confidence is what a commander gives to civilians when the truth would break them. The second wave hit 40 minutes in. The Vraxians had learned from the first assault, splitting their approach into multiple streams that probed for gaps in the minefield. Cole detonated his second ring of charges, collapsing a section of rock wall that blocked one of the flanking channels and forced the stream back into the main corridor. The turrets continued firing, though Draven reported that one was beginning to jam, the improvised mounting unable to handle the sustained heat and vibration. Cole had anticipated this as well. When the first turret failed, he triggered a buried charge beneath it, destroying the turret and the cluster of Vraxians that had been advancing on its position. 1 hour in, and Draven's reports began to carry numbers. He said the forward position had accounted for over 500 confirmed eliminations. 500, in 60 minutes, from one man. But the numbers were not what shook Draven. What shook him was the endurance. Catheran warriors are physically superior to humans in every measurable category. We are stronger, faster, more durable, and more resistant to pain, but we tire in predictable cycles. Our bodies peak and then decline, following a biological rhythm that every Catheran soldier knows intimately. We call it the breaking wall, the moment when the body signals that it has reached its operational limit and begins to shut down non-essential functions to preserve the core. Every warrior has a breaking wall. It is as certain as gravity. Draven said Cole did not have one. 1 hour in, he was moving at the same speed as the first minute. His shots were just as accurate. His transitions between positions were just as fast. He was bleeding from a shrapnel wound on his left arm where a rock fragment had sliced through his sleeve, and he had not slowed down by a single measurable fraction. Catheran physiology would have begun compensating by now, redirecting energy to critical systems and reducing peripheral performance. Cole's physiology appeared to be doing something else entirely. It appeared to be refusing to acknowledge the concept of limitation. 2 hours. The second turret went down. Cole was operating with rifles and buried charges only, and his ammunition was finite. Draven reported that he had moved to his 5th fighting position, which meant he had burned through 5 rifles and was running on his last 2. The Vraxian swarm had adapted again, sending burrowing organisms through the rock channels on the flanks. Cole had collapsed 2 of those channels with charges hours ago, but a third remained open, and the burrowers were threading through it toward the secondary line. Cole saw them. Draven said he saw Cole pause at his position, track the movement in the flank channel, and then sprint, not to another fighting position, but to the channel itself, where he detonated his last buried charge at point-blank range. The explosion sealed the channel and threw Cole backward into the dirt. Draven said he was down for 4 seconds. Then he got up and ran back to his 6th rifle. 4 seconds. He had been blown off his feet by an explosion and was operational again in 4 seconds. Draven's voice cracked when he reported this. Not from fear, from something that Catheran soldiers are not supposed to feel when watching another species fight. Something dangerously close to awe. I was deep in the tunnels by then, shepherding the last group of civilians toward the ridge exit. The sounds of battle were muffled to dull thuds and distant cracking, but each one landed in my chest like a fist. My mind was doing something it had never done before, running 2 processes simultaneously that I could not reconcile. One process was tactical, counting civilians, checking the route, estimating time to the ridge. The other process was dismantling every belief I had held about the man I had married, brick by brick, with the methodical thoroughness of a demolition charge. He ran every morning, because humans are not born strong. They build themselves. They wake up every single day and choose to push their bodies past comfort, past pain, past the point where any rational biology would stop, because they learned 10,000 years ago on a brutal planet that the difference between survival and extinction was the willingness to suffer voluntarily so that suffering involuntarily would not destroy them. He did not sleep the night he found the signal anomaly because humans do not require full rest cycles to maintain function when their survival instincts engage. Their bodies have a mechanism, a flood of chemical urgency, that can keep them operational for days at the cost of later collapse. He had been running on that mechanism for nearly a week, and I had mistaken his fatigue for weakness. He inventoried medical supplies because he knew people would bleed. He checked evacuation routes because he knew people would need to run. He walked the perimeter and studied terrain because he was building the battle plan that was now saving our lives. And he did all of it without telling me, because I had made it abundantly clear that I did not consider him worth listening to. Every single thing I mocked was preparation. Every single thing I dismissed was discipline. Every single thing I laughed at was a warrior doing what warriors do, expressed in a language I was too blinded by my own superiority to read. The last civilian cleared the tunnel exit onto the southern ridge at 2 hours and 43 minutes after the battle began. The Kitharan rear guard sealed the tunnel entrance behind them. I should have felt relief. I should have turned my attention to organizing the defensive perimeter on the ridge and counting heads and preparing for the possibility that the fleets would not arrive in time. Instead, I turned around and started running back through the tunnels toward the fight. I do not remember making the decision. There was no conscious thought, no tactical justification, no strategic rationale. There was only the sound of gunfire still echoing through the rock above me, thinner now, slower, each shot spaced further apart than the last, and the absolute certainty that I could not stand on that ridge and listen to my husband die. I emerged from the tunnel system near the secondary line at 2 hours and 51 minutes. Draven and his warriors were at their positions, weapons ready, eyes forward. Not one of them was firing. In nearly 3 hours of battle, not a single Vraxian had made it past Cole's forward position to reach the secondary line. I pushed past Draven and looked out at the northern approach, and what I saw will stay behind my eyes until the day I stop breathing. The approach corridor was unrecognizable, cratered, scorched, choked with dust and smoke that the wind was slowly pulling apart. The ground was carpeted with Vraxian dead, bodies piled so thick in places that they formed ridges and walls of their own, a landscape of chitin and broken limbs that stretched back toward the plain in an unbroken field of destruction. The smell was overwhelming, acid and ozone, and the copper tang of human blood mixed with the chemical burn of Vraxian fluids. And in the middle of it, at his 7th and final fighting position, Cole Hastings was still fighting. He had run out of rifles. He was firing his sidearm with his right hand, each shot placed with a precision that seemed impossible given his condition. His left arm hung at an angle that suggested something was either badly torn or broken. His face was streaked with blood from a gash above his eye, and his clothing was shredded and darkened with burns and impacts. He was standing in a shallow depression surrounded by Vraxian dead, stacked high enough to form a natural barricade, and the swarm was still pressing forward, still climbing over their own fallen, still trying to reach this one impossible creature that would not stop. He was using his entrenching tool in his left hand despite the injury, swinging it in short, brutal arcs at anything that crested the barricade of bodies around him. A Vraxian lunged over the top, and he put a round through its central nerve cluster at point-blank range, while simultaneously driving the entrenching tool into the thorax of another that was clawing at his flank. He moved with a fluidity that defied his injuries, operating on something that went beyond adrenaline or training or willpower, some fundamental human refusal to accept that the body's limits were the mind's limits. I whispered his name. The wind took it. And then the sky changed. The first thing I saw was light. Blue-white, impossibly bright, streaking down through the atmosphere in parallel lines that carved the clouds apart. Engine flare. Military-grade engine flare, the signature of warships dropping from orbit at combat speed. The human fleet had arrived. 3 destroyers broke through the cloud layer in a triangular formation, their hulls glowing with atmospheric entry heat, and they opened fire before they had fully stabilized their descent. The kinetic barrage hit the rear echelon of the Vraxian swarm with a force that turned solid ground into vapor. The shock wave flattened everything within a kilometer of the impact zone, and the sound that followed was so deep and so absolute that it bypassed my ears entirely and registered as a pressure change in my chest. Atmospheric gunships peeled away from the destroyers and screamed down toward the surface, their weapons systems painting the swarm with targeting lasers before unleashing coordinated strafing runs that drove the Vraxians into fragmented clusters. The hive mind coordination shattered. Without the command organisms that the fleet's precision strikes had targeted first, the individual swarm elements lost cohesion and began to scatter. Within 30 minutes, the battle was over. Within an hour, the northern plain was silent except for the hum of human gunship engines holding patrol patterns overhead. I walked to the forward position. The ground beneath my feet crunched with chitin fragments and spent casings. The path Cole had fought along was marked by a trail of empty magazines and blast craters and Vraxian dead that grew denser the closer I got to his final position. I counted bodies without meaning to. The number I reached before I stopped counting was somewhere past 1100, and I was not yet at the center. He was sitting on the ground when I reached him. His back was against the rock wall of his last fighting position, his legs extended in front of him, his sidearm empty beside him, the entrenching tool bent almost in half and lying across his lap. He was covered in Vraxian fluid and his own blood. The shrapnel wound on his arm had been joined by a dozen others, cuts and burns and impacts that mapped the 3 hours of combat across his body like a record written in damage. His hands were raw and blistered from overheated weapons. His breathing was ragged and shallow, each inhale catching on something painful inside his chest. But he was alive, and when he heard my footsteps and looked up at me, the first thing he said was not about the pain or the blood or the army he had just held off alone. He said, in a voice that sounded like it had been dragged across gravel, "Did everyone make it?" I nodded. I could not speak. The wall I had built inside myself, the one that separated what I had believed from what was true, had collapsed completely, and the debris of it was filling every part of me. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the rock. He said, "Good. That is good." Human medics descended from the fleet's landing craft within minutes, a team of 4 who moved with the calm urgency of professionals accustomed to pulling their people out of impossible situations. They assessed Cole's injuries with scanners and quick hands, applying wound sealant and stabilizing his arm and pressing a breathing mask over his face that hissed with medical gases. He tried to wave them off. They ignored him. I understood for the first time that this was a dynamic that had played out before, probably many times, a man who pushed himself to the edge, and the people whose job it was to pull him back from it. I stayed beside him. I did not help, because the medics did not need my help, and I did not speak, because I did not yet have words for what was happening inside me. I just stayed. And when he opened his eyes and saw me still there, something in his expression shifted, softened, became briefly vulnerable, in a way I had never been allowed to see. Then the medics gave him something for the pain, and his eyes closed again. A human naval officer arrived at the forward position an hour later. Her name was Captain Elaine Grant, a compact woman, with iron-gray hair, and the bearing of someone who had commanded warships for longer than most people had been alive. She reviewed the tactical data from the battle, walking the forward position with a scanner that reconstructed Cole's movements and firing patterns in 3-dimensional overlay. She studied the minefield placement, the turret positions, the fighting positions, the charge detonation sequence. She said nothing for a long time. Then she pulled Cole's service record. I was standing close enough to see her face change when she read it. The professional composure cracked for just a moment, replaced by something that looked like recognition, and something heavier that might have been sorrow. She looked at me and asked if I knew what my husband had done before Rethon. I said I did not. I said I had never asked. She told me Cole had served in the 7th Special Operations Group, a unit called the Reapers. I asked what that meant. She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words, and then she said that the Reapers were the operators humanity sent when the mission was considered more important than the person being sent. They deployed alone or in pairs into situations where survival was not part of the operational calculation. They completed their objectives, or they did not come back. Cole's record showed more confirmed solo deployments behind enemy lines than any operator currently in active human service. I stood there in the dust and the blood and the wreckage of 1,400 Vraxian dead, and tried to fit this information into the shape of the man I had married. The man who cooked meals and studied my customs, and asked about my day, and never once, in all the months we had lived together, mentioned that he was one of the most lethal individual combatants his species had ever produced. He did not tell me because he did not need me to know. He did not need my recognition, or my approval, or my respect to understand his own worth. He had carried it quietly, without display, without demand, the way a sheathed blade carries its edge. And I had looked at the sheath and called it empty. Commander Torath came to the forward position before the day was out. He stood among the Vraxian dead and looked at the evidence of what one human had done in 3 hours with improvised weapons and mining charges. And then he did something that had never been done in the recorded history of the Kytheran military. He offered Cole the warrior's acknowledgement. The acknowledgement is our highest individual honor, a ritual that dates back to the founding of the first Kytheran warband. It has been offered fewer than 200 times in our history, and never, not once, to a non-Kytheran. It is a recognition that transcends rank and species and politics, an admission that the recipient has performed an act of valor so singular that it reshapes the boundaries of what the observers believed was possible. Draven performed the salute first. The same Draven who had made jokes about my husband in the training yard. The same Draven who had asked if the soft one wanted to spar. He stepped forward, placed his fist against his chest plate, bowed his head, and held the posture in perfect silence. One by one, every Kytheran warrior in the garrison followed. 36 fists against 36 chest plates. 36 heads bowed to a man who could not have weighed more than half of any one of them. Cole stood there, supported by a medic on one side because his legs were not entirely steady, and he received the acknowledgement with a single nod. No speech, no grandstanding, no visible pride, just a nod, simple and honest, from a man who had done what needed to be done and did not require an audience to tell him what it meant. I watched my people honor my husband, and the shame I felt was not a sharp thing. It was deep and wide and heavy, a tectonic shift inside my chest that rearranged everything I had built my identity upon. I had spent months believing I was the strong one. I had spent months believing he was a burden I carried with dignity. I had been wrong in a way that was not simply incorrect, but fundamentally, structurally, catastrophically inverted. He had been carrying me the entire time, carrying my disdain, my dismissal, my casual cruelty, and he had carried it without complaint, because that is what he does. He carries what needs to be carried, and he does not stop. That night, after the fleets had established a defensive perimeter, and the outpost was being assessed for damage, and the civilians were being brought back from the southern ridge, I found Cole on the observation deck. The same observation deck where I used to stand and watch him run and think of him as weak. He was leaning against the railing, bandaged and braced, his face turned toward the northern plain where the cleanup crews were working under floodlights. I stood beside him. The silence between us was different now. It was not the silence of two people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who have too much to say and are trying to find where to begin. I spoke first. I said I needed to tell him something, and I needed him to let me say it without telling me it was fine. He nodded. I told him everything, every thought I had never spoken, and every thought I had spoken too freely. Every time I watched him run, and called it pathetic in my mind. Every time I ate his food and considered it a servant's offering. Every time I laughed with my soldiers at his expense, and felt nothing, not even guilt. Every time I looked at his soft skin and his sweating body, and his need for sleep and food and maintenance, and saw it as evidence that he was less than me. I told him that I had been blind, but not the kind of blindness that comes from not seeing, the kind that comes from deciding what you are looking at before you open your eyes. I told him that I had decided he was weak the moment I learned he was human, and that everything I observed after that decision was filtered through a verdict I had already reached. I told him that I was wrong, and that wrong was not a strong enough word. I told him that in Kytheran culture, the highest form of courage is dying in battle, that our songs, and our histories, and our warrior traditions all build toward the same glorious endpoint, the moment when a soldier gives everything and is consumed by it. But what he had done was something my culture did not have a word for. He had faced certain death, not for glory, not for honor, not for a warrior's legacy, but because it was the right thing to do, because people needed to live, and he could give them the time they needed. And then, instead of dying, he had simply refused. He had stood there in the teeth of an army and refused to fall, not through superior biology or divine intervention, but through the raw, grinding, bottomless stubbornness of a species that has been defying its own physical limitations since the first human ancestor picked up a rock and decided that being small and soft and fragile was not going to be the end of the story. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not tell me it was fine or that he understood or that it did not matter. He let the words land where they needed to land, and when I was finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, however long that might be. He said, "I was not brave out there, Valeth. I was terrified. Every second. Humans do not stop being afraid. We just keep going anyway. That is all we are. We are the species that keeps going." I asked him why he never told me what he was, what he had done, what he was capable of. He had months to set the record straight, months to push back against my contempt with the truth of his service record and his training and the things he had survived before he ever set foot on Rethalon. He could have shut down every joke, corrected every assumption, silenced every dismissal with a single sentence about who he really was. Why did he choose silence? He looked at me, and his eyes were tired and honest and completely without pretense. He said, "Because I did not marry you to be feared. I married you to build something, a life, a partnership. I did not want you to see a weapon. I wanted you to see a husband." Something broke inside me then. Not the wall I had built. That was already gone. Something older and deeper, something connected to who I had been before this day. The version of Valeth Sorand who measured worth in armor thickness and kill counts, and the ability to absorb damage without flinching. That version cracked and fell away, and what was left standing was someone who understood, finally and completely, that strength is not a single thing. It is not density or durability, or the ability to shrug off a blade. Strength is whatever allows you to keep standing when every rational calculation says you should fall. And by that definition, the man beside me was the strongest creature I had ever known. I cried. For the first time in my adult life, a Kytheran warrior cried. Not from pain or grief or fear, but from the overwhelming, crushing weight of understanding arriving all at once, too late and just in time. Cole put his hand on mine, his bandaged, blistered human hand on my armored Kytheran hand. He did not say it was fine. He did not say he forgave me. He just held on, and that was enough. In the days that followed, word of what happened at Outpost Rethan spread through channels both military and civilian. The specific details, one human holding a choke point against a Vraxian swarm for 3 hours and accounting for over 1,400 confirmed eliminations, reached the Galactic Council within a week. The reaction was seismic. Species that had dismissed humans as biologically inferior began requesting access to human military training doctrine. The Kytheran High Command formally proposed expanded joint training programs with human special operations forces, the first time in our history that we had acknowledged another species might have something to teach us about combat. The alliance between our two species, which had been built on political convenience and maintained through obligation, began to evolve into something else, something built on the understanding that strength takes forms that are not always visible, and that the species you dismiss as fragile might be the one standing over you when the dust settles. Cole recovered. The medic said his injuries were numerous, but not life-threatening, that human bodies are remarkably good at repairing themselves, given time and resources. He was up and moving within days, slower than usual, favoring his left side, but moving. He returned to his routines as soon as the medics cleared him. The morning runs, the signal monitoring, the cooking, the quiet, steady maintenance of systems and people, and the small, invisible infrastructure of daily life that holds everything together. I watched him differently now. I watched him run the perimeter trail and saw a man who understood that the body is a tool that must be maintained through constant, voluntary effort. I watched him cook and saw a man who expressed care through acts of service, because his species learned long ago that survival is a communal project, not an individual achievement. I watched him sit at his monitoring station and saw a man who stayed vigilant, because vigilance is what kept his people alive on a planet that tried to kill them every day for 100,000 years. Humans are not born strong. They are born soft and small and vulnerable, on a world that is full of predators and poisons and extremes of temperature that would kill most species in hours. And instead of evolving armor or venom or claws, they evolved something stranger and more terrifying. They evolved the ability to look at their own weakness and decide, consciously and deliberately, that it was not going to define them. They build themselves, every single day, through pain and repetition, and the stubborn refusal to accept their biological constraints as final. They build themselves into something that can endure what should destroy them. I know this now. I know it because I watched it happen. I watched a man who bleeds when he is cut, and breaks when he is struck, and tires when he is pushed, stand alone against an army, and hold the line through nothing but will, and preparation, and the absolute, unshakable conviction that falling down is not the same as being finished. The observation deck at dawn is quiet now. The floodlights on the northern plain have been shut off, the cleanup completed, the craters filled, the scars in the rocks slowly being erased by wind and time. Below me, Cole is running the perimeter trail. Same pace, same route, same steady breathing that I can just barely hear if the wind is right. He is the same man he was before the battle, the same man he was the day he arrived at Raytheon, with one bag and a handshake. He did not become something new when the swarm came. He simply stopped hiding what he had always been. I lean against the railing and watch him run, and the word that comes to mind is not the one I would have used 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, I would have thought, pathetic. Now the word that fills my chest and presses against my ribs, and makes it difficult to breathe, is one that does not translate well from Catharan to any other language, but the closest approximation would be this. I see you now. And I mean it. Every morning, every run. Every quiet act of strength that I was too blind to recognize, I see it all now, and I will spend whatever time I have left making sure he knows it. Not because he needs me to see him, he never did, but because seeing him clearly is the least I owe the man who carried my contempt in one hand and my survival in the other, and never once asked me to choose which one was heavier. He rounds the far corner of the perimeter and disappears behind the eastern wall, and I stand there in the early light and wait for him to come back around. He always comes back around. That is the thing about humans. That is the thing about Cole. They keep going.